Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com, and I wanted to talk to you today about creating RESTful web services with JAX-RS using Apache TomEE and the Eclipse IDE as well. Now I've got Eclipse Oxygen installed here. I've also got, if you look on my file system, you can see that I've got Tomcat installed, and that's actually TomEE. Just basic Tomcat doesn't have built-in support for JAX-RS right now, so you're going to need the EE edition. But if you have all of that set up, all you have to do is head over to Eclipse and create a new web project. I'm going to create a new web project here. It's a dynamic web project. And I'm going to give it the name RESTful Java, and I'm going to select 3.1 as my dynamic project. No configuration options there, but I will put in a target runtime, and I'm going to say that I'm going to use that Apache Tomcat EE 8.5 version, create a local server, and point to that TomEE installation, and that's right there, _Tomcat. And that should bring in all of the required JAX-RS libraries for me. Okay, minimal configuration is what I want. I will click Next. I will click Finish. And hopefully Eclipse hasn't put in too much garbage here. And so looking in Java resources, yes, there's nothing there, and that does indeed make me happy. And so the first thing I need to do is create a new class. I'm going to put this in the com.mcnz.restful.java example package, and I'm going to call this the score service. And from here I'm simply going to click Finish. And this score service is going to keep track of the number of wins, losses, and ties that happens universally when people are playing a rock, paper, scissors application. And so I'm going to declare an int variable for wins, losses, and ties. And we really shouldn't be managing state inside of our RESTful web services, but play along with me here, and we'll try and keep things simple for this particular example. And of course I missed a little comma there. I'm also going to do a quick change of my font size. And so just do Window, Preferences, get into the editor here, change my Java editor font. I'm just looking at this and it might be hard for people to see this as I go by, so let's increase that just a little bit. And what I want to do here with these variables, well, I want people to be able to get the wins, losses, and ties, so I'm going to create getters for these. So source, generate getters and setters. Now I only want getters for these. I don't want people to individually be able to update wins, losses, and ties. If somebody's going to individually update one, that means they've played a game. They probably want to increase the number of wins or losses or ties. And after a game, that should only be increased by 1, right? You can't increase it by 10. And so I'm going to provide my own methods, like increase wins. And we'll just increment the number of wins and return it to the calling program. I'm going to create that exact same class for ties and the exact same class for losses, and I say it's exactly the same except it's different. But you get the idea. We've got increased wins, we've got increased losses, and we've got increased ties, and after we've increased the ties we return to the calling program what the value is of those wins, losses, or ties. Now excuse me as I do a quick sleight of hand here. I'm just going to make that variable static as well. The reason is there's a good likelihood that the JAX-RS framework will create a new score service every single time the score service is invoked, or it might create a pool of them. If we make these static, it makes the state management on the VM a little bit better. As I said, a real RESTful web service, you will put state management elsewhere, but for this little example I think this will work just fine. Now we're going to be using a lot of classes from the JAX-RS package. So I'm just going to do an import right at the top. Import javax.ws.rs.star, and that should give us access to a number of different classes. Notice that, well, I've got a warning because nothing's been used here, but I don't have a red X. If you've got a red X, you can't link to those files, so you might not be using TOM.EE, or you're linking to a runtime library that doesn't support JAX-RS. I'm using TOM.EE, so this is going to work just fine. And of course, with these increase wins methods, I've stated in an article that I wrote about designing RESTful APIs properly, I said that this method is not idempotent. As a result, it should use a post invocation. The path for this is simply going to be /score/wins. And I think this is going to produce, I think that should just be path, and this particular method produces JSON. And I'll double click so you can get a better look at that. But that is all we have to do to annotate this particular method in order for it to be accessed as a RESTful web service. I'm going to add something similar to increase ties, except for ties it will be ties, and then for increase losses it will be /losses. But the idea is it's a post invocation with a resource referencing URL. Oh, and these aren't going to generate JSON, they're just going to generate plain text. But these objects, these resources are going to be accessed through a URL that points to them. In this case, it's going to be the post method that calls them, and these are just going to produce plain text, like the actual number of wins, losses, or ties. Down here with the get methods, these methods will be invoked with a get invocation. A similar path as the post, /score/wins. These two will generate plain text. So these will get all common annotations. And that's about it. That concludes iteration 1 of the development of this RESTful web service. Now, along with these increase wins and get losses types of methods, I also want a method where somebody can actually get the entire score, and I want them to be able to get the entire score as a JSON string that looks something like that: wins, losses, ties. And so I'm going to create a method, and this method is just going to be called getScore. And we're just going to use sort of like formatting, pattern matching. And Java's got a neat little pattern matching or string formatting thing where it will put escape characters in for all of the quotes that we're going to have in here. And of course, I don't want the number 5 hard-coded in there. I want wins, and I don't want 3 hard-coded in. I want losses, and I don't want 0 hard-coded in. I want ties, so I put little placeholders in there, %s, and then I just say return string.format, that pattern, but replace all the %s's with wins, losses, and ties. And that now creates a nice little getScore method, which will be returning this string. Now we have to annotate this, so this is going to use a get invocation. The path is going to be /score, and the produces element in this case will be application JSON, right? Because we're going to be generating JSON here. And now I also want to have an update method, and this update score method will take the number of wins and it's going to update the number of wins, losses, and ties. And that'll just be done by saying score service.wins equals wins, score service.losses equals losses, and score service.ties equals ties. And now this will update these variables managed up here, and when that's done, well, we still need to return a string, so we will just paste the code from above here, put it in here, and that's just going to return a nice little JSON string. And the annotations for this method are going to be very similar. The big distinction is, since somebody is changing state on the server, we need to do a put invocation, not a get invocation. Now the other rub here is we want these to be matched by a query parameter. So for example, when somebody invokes this class, they'll go localhost 8080/restful Java, which I think the context root is, and then /score, and then they'll add query parameters. Wins equals 2 and losses equals 3 and ties equals 15. And so that's how somebody is going to pass the payload to the server. In this case, we want that wins there to get mapped here, this request parameter to get mapped here, and this request parameter to get mapped here. In order to do that, we add these little query param annotations, and I say, hey, get that from a query param that's going to be named wins. And we're going to get that from a query param. Get this formatted nicely here. And that is going to be called losses. And then we're also going to have this query param here, and that's going to be ties. And so now if we get a URL that looks like this with that type of query parameter added to the end of it, the wins will get mapped to wins, the losses will get mapped to losses, and the ties will get mapped to ties. And that's how we put together our RESTful application. And with that saved, it's time to run the program. And so I'm going to quickly say run as and run on server. I'm going to have it run on the Tomcat server. Click next and click finish. Now right away I think this will generate an error message. It'll try and bring up a web page based on the service or something like that. But if I open up a browser window here, and I take the URL, right, RESTful Java, that maps to that, which was the context root that we set, and say, hey, give me the score, I end up getting nothing. Oh, and that's because I forgot one little thing. Right there on the score service, I need to put a path on here. And that's the path there. That is going to be the root path for the object. Okay, let me restart my server. Everything runs and starts up, and once this is all running, I can say localhost 8080 restful java /score. And notice this runs, and when it completes, I've got the score as a nice little JSON string. If I go here and say give me the number of wins, the number of wins comes back as 0. Now if you really want to test this out, you might want to use a utility that can run curl. I've got the git bash shell installed because I've got git installed on my local system. And what was the URL? The URL was that there. And I can just do a curl and say that I want to do a get invocation on that URL. I'm going to put it in quotes because I don't need it right now, but when I get to query parameters, I do need it. And so it looks like I have to type it out. So http colon localhost colon 8080 slash, and what was that, restful java slash score. Is that going to do it? Okay, and notice that we get our JSON there. If I do that again, but invoke it with a post, and instead of saying score, I say slash wins, it'll start changing the number of wins. And you'll notice that that number there goes to 2, and then it goes, or it's right there, it goes 1, 2, 3. That's the output that we're getting. That's not too handsome, so I'll change that to losses, add one of the losses, and add one of the ties. And now if we go back and just try and get the score, notice we are now up to 4 wins, 1 loss, and 1 tie. And then finally we can actually do a put invocation. Right? So let's say if we can do a put, and when we do the put, we want to add query parameters. So we'll say wins equals 11 and losses equals 22 and ties equals 33. I'm just going to look at that, make sure there's no spelling mistakes there. But that's going to be a put invocation. When I do that, it runs. I get the JSON back, but let's make sure that that's not just a little smoke and mirrors. I will do a get invocation once again, and when I do that get invocation, notice I get the JSON file, wins, losses, and ties. And anyways, that's it. That's all there is to putting together a RESTful web service using JAX-RS, Tom-EE, and Eclipse. Just a couple of things to point out here. Making sure that I've got that @ path at the top of the class there. I'd forgotten to put that in. I usually put that in right at the start. And also I made that field static there just to make sure that if they were pooling individual score service objects that I would still maintain that. So that's a little different from what I may have done in another Spring tutorial on the same subject. But of course that's just a bad programming practice to have state in your RESTful web services, but in a future tutorial we'll improve on this and move that state out. But anyways, that's about it. That shows you how easy it is to put together a RESTful web service using JAX-RS and Eclipse.